Since the abolition of the death penalty in England and Wales, which surprisingly was only in 1998, although it had been suspended since 1965, a whole life order is now the most severe sentence that can be awarded in England and Wales. And at the time of recording this video, there are currently 77 living prisoners who are subject to a whole life order. Now, a whole life order is simply a life sentence. The difference being between that and a normal life sentence is there is no minimum term that an individual will serve before being considered eligible for parole. They will never be considered eligible for parole. The only way they will be getting out of prison is if they successfully appeal their conviction or their sentence. Welcome to my channel, Andy on Crime, where I talk about high-profile criminal cases and other aspects of criminal law in England and Wales. In this video, I'm going to go through each person who is subject to a whole life order in the order that they were awarded them, and then I'm going to briefly cover some of the facts that led them to be given a whole life order. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Number 1 is Robert John Maudsley, known as Hannibal the Cannibal amongst the British press. Maudsley has killed 4 people, 3 of which he killed whilst in prison. He was originally sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of John Farrell, before he and another prisoner called David Cheeseman took hostage and tortured to death David Francis. In 1978, he killed a further 2 prisoners, Stanley Darwood, with whom he slit his throat, and Bill Roberts, whom Maudsley hacked at his skull with a makeshift dagger and struck his head against a wall multiple times, killing him. Now, the allegations of him eating part of the brain of one of the men he killed is said to be false, although that did not stop the press from giving him that nickname. He is currently Britain's longest-serving prisoner, following the death of Ian Brady. Number 2 is John Childs. Childs was a contract killer who murdered 6 people between 1974 and 1978. He murdered Terence Eve in 1974, Robert Brown in 1975, George Brett and his 10-year-old son Terry Brett later on in 1975, Fred Sherwood in 1978, and Ronald Andrews later on in 1978, and he was jailed in December of 1979, with the murders being committed by shooting and stabbing. He later confessed to a journalist in 1998 of 5 more murders whilst he was in prison. Number 3 is Arthur Hutchinson. In 1983, Hutchinson gatecrashed a wedding reception at a house in Sheffield shortly after the bride and groom had left, and stabbed to death the bride's father, mother and brother before raping her teenage sister at knife point. Police quickly labelled him as the killer after identifying a handprint on a champagne bottle and a bite mark in a piece of cheese. He was already on the run from answering a charge of violent rape and had previous convictions for offences of violence, indecent assault and dishonesty. Hutchinson was convicted in 1984 and sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommended minimum term of 18 years. However, he was subsequently issued with a whole life tariff by the then Home Secretary Leon Britton. Number 4 on the list is Jeremy Neville Bamber. In October of 1986, Bamber was found guilty of shooting dead his adoptive parents, sister and 6-year-old twin nephews at the family farmhouse in Essex in order to claim a 6-figure inheritance, whilst also laying evidence to suggest that his sister, a known schizophrenic, had committed the murders before killing herself. His trial judge said that he found the idea of ever seeing Bamber free again difficult to foresee and advised that he should serve at least 25 years behind bars. His sentence was later upgraded to a whole life order by the then Home Secretary. Number 5 is John Francis Duffy, known as the Railway Killer. Duffy attacked numerous women in the south of England, raping all of them and murdering 3, before revolutionary psychological profiling helped police to catch him. He was initially sentenced to life with a recommended 30-year minimum sentence for 2 murders and 7 rapes, which would have seen him paroled in 2018. However, the then Home Secretary ruled that Duffy's life sentence should mean life, and a whole life order was awarded. After 12 years in prison, Duffy went on a conscious clearing exercise, admitting to killing a 3rd person with which he had originally been acquitted, and implicating school friend David McCalkey as his accomplice. He also revealed his part in countless other rapes for which he received a further 12 years. Number 6 is Anthony Arkwright. Arkwright was arrested after he hacked and battered to death 3 people, including his elderly grandfather, on a 2-day killing spree in South Yorkshire in August of 1988, when he was aged just 21, which means he is likely to have been the youngest offender to have been issued with a whole-life tariff. Number 7 on the list is Mark Robinson. In 1979, Robinson, who had recently joined the Royal Air Force, killed Patricia Ann Wagner at the age of 17 after she threatened to tell his mother about the affair the two were having, to which Robinson responded by strangling her. When he was released from prison in 1989, he met Sharon Morley in Wakefield, with the two moving to Billingham shortly thereafter. However, Sharon wanted to move back to Wakefield, which caused arguments. On the 19th of September 1989, he discovered a photo of a former boyfriend, and in the argument that followed, he beat and stabbed her to death. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at his trial and was later issued with a whole-life tariff. Number 8 is Malcolm Green. In 1971, he was jailed for life for the brutal murder of a Cardiff prostitute, Glenys Johnson, where he slashed her throat. He spent 18 years in prison before being released on parole in 1989. Soon afterwards, he bludgeoned to death a young tourist from New Zealand called Clive Tully. Green dismembered the body, wrapped it in plastic bags, and then dumped it in different places along a road in South Wales. He was sentenced to life again in October 1991, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years, but was given a whole-life tariff by the then Home Secretary. Number 9 is perhaps one of the most infamous names on the list, Rose West. Rose West was convicted in November of 1995 of the murder of 10 women and girls at her home in Gloucester, including one of her daughters and her stepdaughter, between 1971 and 1987. Her husband, Fred West, committed suicide in jail before he could stand trial for a total of 12 murders. Rose West's trial judge recommended that she should never be released. The Lord Chief Justice later ruled that West should serve a minimum of 25 years, but in 1997, Home Secretary Jack Straw ruled that West should never be released. Number 10 is Peter Howard Moore, known as the Man in Black, as he was known for wearing a black shirt and tie. He murdered 4 men in apparently sexually motivated attacks in Wales. He confessed to the police, but claimed at trial that it was in fact a fictional lover called Jason who had killed them. The jury disbelieved him and he was found guilty. Following his conviction, the judge said he would urge the Home Secretary to impose a whole-life tariff, which they then did. Now, everyone that I've mentioned on this list thus far has had their whole-life term imposed on them by a Home Secretary rather than a judge. A European Court of Human Rights decision changed the law following this so that only trial judges and the High Court have the power to impose whole-life orders going forward. So everyone that is mentioned from now on has had their whole-life order awarded by the courts and not the Home Secretary. Number 11 is Jeremy Thorpe Wing. This is an unusual case, as Wing is one of the very few people who has received a whole-life order for an offence other than murder. Wing, who was 61 when he was sentenced, was found guilty of sexually abusing 2 children, who were only 7 when the abuse began. Police raided Wing's home, discovering footage of Wing and another man called Brian Hogg abusing children. Both were convicted of 2 counts of rape that were so severe that the victims would have physical injuries for life, and the judge was of the opinion that neither Wing nor Hogg would ever be safe to be released, and sentenced them both to life imprisonment with a whole-life order. Now, Hogg's life sentence was later overturned, but Wing's remains in place. Number 12 is Paul Glen. Now, Glen is another person who was jailed for murder, released, and then murdered again. He was employed as a hitman and in 2004 was hired to kill Vincent Smart, but he instead killed the wrong person, killing Mr. Smart's friend Robert Bogle. Now, Glen had previously killed hotelier Ivor Usher in February 1989 before serving 13 years and being released in 2002. He would then go on to kill again just 2 years later. At 13 on the list is Phillip Peter Heggarty. He was sentenced to a whole life order after he murdered his friend Derek Bennett in a hammer attack in 2003, before he put Bennett's body in a Renault Laguna and then set it on fire. Bennett's body was so badly burned that they were only able to identify him through dental records. At 14 on the list is Thomas Hamilton McDowell. The McDowell murdered and dismembered German trainee rabbi Andreas Heinz, then dumped his head, limbs and torso in bin bags in Camden in North London. McDowell is said to have suffered abuse as a child and grew up hating homosexuals. Number 15 is Mark Martin. Martin wanted to become Nottingham's first serial killer when he killed 3 homeless women, Katie Baxter, Zoe Pennick and Ellen Frith, between December 2004 and January 2005. He strangled Ellen and then was said to have boasted about killing Katie and Zoe. 2 of his accomplices were convicted alongside him in 2005, but received 14 years and 25-year minimum terms, whereas Martin received a whole life order. At 16 is Mark Richard Hobson. Hobson murdered his girlfriend Claire Sanderson at their home near Selby in July 2004, before luring her twin sister Diana to the same place and murdering her several days later. He then murdered an elderly couple called James and Joan Britton before going on the run and was later arrested near a petrol station in North Yorkshire. He pleaded guilty to all of the charges in April 2005, but despite pleading guilty, he was still given a whole life order, which he later appealed, but that appeal was rejected. At number 17 and 18 is William Horncy and Kenneth Regan. This is the first double entry on the list. Both Horncy and Regan were given whole life orders for murdering the millionaire Amjit Chauhan and his family in order to take over their freight business, allowing them to ship drugs into the UK. The bodies of Chauhan's 2 sons have never been found. At 19 on the list is Viktor Dembovskis. He was a Latvian immigrant who raped and murdered 17-year-old Jeshma Raithata before fleeing back to Latvia. He was deported back to the UK to stand trial, and it was revealed that he had a raft of previous criminal convictions in Latvia, including 2 rapes in the 1990s. Given his record, he was given a whole life order, which was a rare sentence for someone guilty of a single murder in these circumstances. At 20 is John McGrady. McGrady was a convicted rapist who went on to strangle and mutilate 15-year-old neighbour Rochelle Holness in Catford, London in September of 2005 before dumping her dismembered remains in bin bags. He then attempted suicide but survived before going on to admit the murder later in court. McGrady had previously been sentenced for a total of 11 years in prison for 2 attacks in 1988 and 1993. He was awarded a whole life order. Number 21 is Stephen McColl. McColl was a gangster who murdered 2 people, Michael Doran, one of his own gang, and Phillip Noakes. The motive for the murder of Doran was that McColl suspected him of being an informant. Ironically, McColl himself became an informant for Greater Manchester Police 2 months after the murder of Michael Doran. Number 22 is Rohan Arshad. Arshad, who worked as a taxi driver, murdered his wife Uzma Rohan and their sons Adam, Abbas and daughter Henna because of his wife's affair with a married man. He bludgeoned them all to death with a rounder's bat. At 23 is Andrew Randall. Randall murdered his baby daughter Jessica after he threw her headfirst into a settee following weeks of violence against her. Jessica, who was born 5 weeks prematurely, was abused from almost the moment that she left hospital until her death in 2005. Randall admitted murder as well as causing grievous bodily harm and 4 counts of sexually abusing Jessica. Number 24 is David William Tiley. Tiley, a convicted double rapist, was released from prison for those offences, and only 2 months later he stabbed to death his disabled fiancée Susan Hale and then killed her carer Sarah Merritt when she arrived at their home in Southampton. At 25 is Michael Smith. This is yet another example of someone who has committed murder, went to prison, was released and then murdered again. In 1975, he murdered his 18-year-old girlfriend, Sheila Deakin, before spending 30 years in prison. 12 months after he was released on parole, he murdered Peter Summers, who he attacked with a bottle in August of 2006. At number 26 is Stephen Gerald James Wright, who became known as the Suffolk Strangler. Wright murdered 5 women in Ipswich in December of 2006. His victims were Tanya Nicol, Gemma Adams, Anil Alderton, Annette Nichols, and Paula Clennell. During his trial, he admitted to having sex with all 5 victims and that he had been paying for sex workers' services since the 1980s. DNA and fibre evidence were presented to the court that linked Wright to the victims. He was found guilty of all 5 murders on the 21st of February 2008 and was sentenced the following day to a whole life order. At 27 is Levi Belfield, another particularly infamous killer. Belfield was jailed for the murder of 2 young women, Marsha McDonnell and Amélie Delagrange, whilst he also seriously injured a third, Kate Sheedy, though mercifully she survived. He was given a whole life order for those offences. He was later identified whilst he was in prison as the killer of Millie Dowler in 2002. He was charged with her murder in 2010 and was later found guilty. Following his conviction for Millie's murder, he was given another whole life order, making him the first person in the UK to be given 2 separate whole life orders. He is also suspected in a number of other unsolved murders in the early 1990s. At 28 is Douglas Gary Vinter. Vinter has also killed 2 people on separate occasions, either side of serving a prison sentence for the first murder. In August of 1995, he murdered local railway worker Carl Eden. He served 9 years before he was released. He then murdered his wife, Anne White, in February of 2008. For that murder, he was awarded a whole life order, which he later challenged, but the sentence was upheld. And whilst he has been in prison, he has attempted to murder another inmate, Lee Newell, who I'll talk about later on in this video, and he has also wounded child killer Roy Whiting. At 29 is Simon Wilson. Wilson was sentenced to a whole life order in 2008 after admitting grievous bodily harm, sexual assault, and the attempted rape of a 71-year-old victim. Wilson, who emigrated to Australia with his family when he was a toddler, had committed a staggering 77 offences in Australia, including 6 rapes and a savage killing. He was then deported back to the UK, where he committed the offences against his elderly victim mere weeks after arriving back in the UK. At number 30 is Marc Chivers. He strangled to death his ex-girlfriend Maria Stubbings with a dog lead in December of 2008. He pleaded guilty to the crime in court 12 months later and was given a whole life order. He had previously served 15 years in a prison in Germany for murdering another ex-girlfriend and was deported back to the UK in January of 2008, some 11 months prior to his second murder. Number 31 on the list is John Nigel Madden. Madden drugged, raped and killed his 12-year-old niece, Tia Rigg, at his Manchester home after luring her there on the pretext of babysitting. He telephoned his sister Lynn, Tia's mother, and asked Tia to go to his home in order to babysit his own 10-year-old daughter. When she arrived, he drugged her and then inflicted a horrific catalogue of sexual injuries before stabbing her and strangling her with a guitar string. At 32 is Desmond Lee. Lee is another prisoner who has killed twice either side of a prison sentence. He was convicted in 1990 of murdering his landlady, Shirley Carr, after she is said to have taunted him over the breakdown of a relationship. He served 14 years before being released in 2004. In 2010, he was convicted of murdering his lover, Christopher Pratt, by breaking his voice box and a bone in his neck in his flat, and then using his credit cards to go on a shopping spree before dumping his body. The judge in the case, Mrs. Justice Nicola Davis, told Lee that less than 5 years after your release, you killed Christopher Pratt, and in the circumstances, the order which I propose to make is a whole life order, which is exactly what that means. At 33 is Wilbert Anthony Dice. Dice was convicted of a historic triple murder in 2010 that took place in 1982. Norma Richards, who was 27, and her daughters Samantha, who was 9, and Soretta, who was 7, were found murdered at their home in Dalston. Dice staged the murders to look like a racially motivated attack, but was caught following breakthroughs in DNA technology that showed Dice had committed the murders. Judge Anthony Morris said, "I am satisfied the seriousness of these offences is exceptionally high and you should never be released." Number 34 is Stephen Sean Griffiths. Griffiths was convicted of the murder of 3 women in Bradford, one of the murders involving the use of a crossbow. 43-year-old Susan Rushworth disappeared on the 22nd of June 2009, followed by 31-year-old Shelley Armitage on the 26th of April 2010, and 36-year-old Susanna Blamiers on the 21st of May. The women were all sex workers based in Bradford. Part of Suzanne's body was found in the River Aire near Bradford on the 25th of May, and other human tissue found in the same river was established as belonging to Shelley Armitage. No remains of Sophie Rushworth were ever found. At 35 is John Sweeney. Sweeney murdered 2 women, one in London and another in the Netherlands. Melissa Halstead's body was found in a Rotterdam canal in 1990. Paula Fields was found in Regent's Canal in 2001. Both had been mutilated before being cut up and dumped in the respective canals. It is also believed that Sweeney may have killed other women. When Sweeney was convicted of those 2 murders, having already served a life sentence for the attempted murder of a 3rd girlfriend with whom he attacked with an axe and a knife, he refused to leave his prison cell at Belmarsh to hear his sentence. At 36 is George Norman Johnson. Johnson was given a whole life order in 2011 following the murder of 89-year-old Florence Habesh whilst he was under the influence of heroin and crack cocaine. He had previously served 20 years of a life sentence from 1986 following his conviction for the murder of a hotel worker called Gerald Homer, whom Johnson made strip naked. He then stole £8 off of him and then set about the man, stabbing him 35 times with a pair of scissors and a knife. He was released for the first murder in 2006 on licence before killing again 4 years later. At 37 on the list is John William Cooper. On the 26th of May 2011, he was given a whole life order for the 1985 double murder of siblings Richard and Helen Thomas and the 1989 double murders of Peter and Gwenda Dixon. The murders were known in the media as the Pembrokeshire murders or the Coastal murders. Richard and Helen Thomas were murdered by Cooper in their home before he then burnt it down. The murders of Peter and Gwenda Dixon occurred after Cooper had tied the couple up, demanded that they hand out their bank card, and then forced them to disclose their PIN number. Cooper, carrying a sawed-off shotgun, robbed Peter Dixon of £300 and then shot the couple in the face at point-blank range. Next on the list at 38 is David Baxendale. Baxendale subjected Sarah Thomas, who was 38, from Nuffield in Surrey, to a ferocious attack which left her with multiple injuries, including a fatal stab wound to the neck after she refused his offer of a kiss. The 40-year-old then fled the country on a ferry and travelled to southern Spain. Baxendale had a history of violence stretching back some 20 years. In 2001, he was convicted of murder in Spain, where he had repeatedly stabbed his victim, and for which he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. He served 7 years of his sentence before being deported back to Britain, and was then awarded a whole life order for the murder of Sarah Thomas. At 39 is Andrew Dawson. Dawson is another person who has previously committed murder, but had been released before killing again. In 2010, Andrew Dawson killed 2 of his neighbours, Paul Hancock and John David Matthews, in their flats in Derby. The 2 men were both found with multiple stab wounds 5 days apart. Previous to this,
Dawson was jailed for the killing of a 91-year-old man in Lancashire in 1982 and was released on licence in 1999. He returned to jail for breaching his conditions in 2003, 2004 and 2007 and was last released from prison in 2008, 2 years before he committed the double murder. At number 40 is Mark Leonard Bridger. Bridger was found guilty of abducting and murdering 5-year-old April Jones, who was last seen alive on the 1st of October 2012. He claimed to have accidentally run over her whilst driving and that he could not remember where he had hidden the body due to being intoxicated. On the 30th of May 2013, he was found guilty of abduction, murder and perverting the course of justice and was sentenced to a whole life order. Although April's body has never been found, police linked her DNA profile to bone fragments and blood found in Bridger's home and concluded that she had suffered unsurvivable injuries. At number 41 on the list is Dale Christopher Cregan. A double police murderer, Cregan killed PC's Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone, both of Greater Manchester Police, in September of 2012. Cregan made a hoax emergency call to the police, which Nicola and Fiona responded to. When they arrived, Cregan shot them and threw an M75 hand grenade at them. Both officers were hit by at least 8 bullets. He later handed himself into the police station and admitted the killings of Fiona and Nicola. Prior to these killings, he had killed father and son Mark and David Short in separate attacks. On the 25th of May 2012, Cregan shot dead Mark Short in the Cotton Tree pub in Droylsden. In August later that year, he killed Mark's father, David Short, at his house in Clayton by shooting him and throwing a hand grenade at him. At 42 and 43 is Gary David Smith and Lee William Newell. Smith and Newell were both given whole life orders for the murder of convicted child killer Subhad Anwar in his cell at HMP Long Larton. They strangled him to death with his own tracksuit bottoms. Both attackers were already serving life for murder. Smith, from Leicester, was jailed in 1999 for the murder of 22-year-old Ali Hassan, whose naked body was thrown into a quarry. Smith believed Hassan was a police informer. Newell had been sent to prison in the late 1980s after tricking his way into the house of 56-year-old Mary Neal, a neighbour in Norwich, and strangling her to death. He hid her body in a cupboard of her home before getting away with just over £60. At 44 is Jamie Reynolds. Reynolds murdered 17-year-old Georgia Williams after luring her to his home in Wellington, Shropshire in May 2013. He then dumped her body near Wrexham in North Wales, where it was found just after his arrest in Glasgow several days later. Reynolds confessed to the murder on the 2nd of December 2013. Sentencing was delayed until the 19th of December when the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a whole life order. This was after reading reports from psychiatrists stating that Reynolds had the potential to progress into a serial killer had he not been apprehended, and was likely to remain a danger to women for the rest of his life. At 45 is Anwar Daniel Rosser. Described as a psychotic, bullying alcoholic, 33-year-old Rosser, a former soldier, murdered sleeping 4-year-old Riley Turner in a savage and sadistic attack on the 20th of January 2013, whilst Rosser was staying at the Turner family home. The motive for the killing remains unknown. He admitted the murder in court a year later and was sentenced to a whole life order. He appealed his sentence in October of 2014, but this was rejected. Number 46 on the list is Ian John McLoughlin. McLoughlin has committed 2 murders and has also been convicted of manslaughter. His first killing was in 1984 when he bludgeoned 49-year-old Len Delegati with a hammer before strangling him. The jury chose to convict him of manslaughter rather than murder on the 19th of September 1984, and he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, later reduced to 8 years. In September of 1990, just over a year after being let out of prison, he murdered Peter Halls in Brighton and was sentenced to life in July 1992, with the Lord Chief Justice recommending a minimum term of 14 years. 21 years later, on the 13th of July 2013, he was released on licence, and on that day, during the course of a robbery, he murdered Graham Buck, an innocent man investigating a neighbour's cries for help. Following a ruling by British judges in February of 2014 that whole life orders were lawful, McLaughlin's original 40-year sentence for that murder was quashed and a whole life order was applied to him. At number 47 is Michael Olumed Adebolajo, another infamous killer on this list. On the 22nd of May 2013, Adebolajo, along with another individual called Michael Adebowale, murdered British Army soldier Lee Rigby near the Royal Artillery Barracks in Woolwich, southeast London. In a video shot by a bystander, Adebolajo said, "The only reason we have killed this man today is because Muslims are dying daily by British soldiers." Adebolajo also gave a bystander at the scene a handwritten 2-page note setting out his justification for his actions. 29-year-old Adebolajo was found guilty of Lee Rigby's murder on the 19th of December 2013, as was Adebowale. Adebolajo was sentenced at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, to a whole life order. Adebowale avoided a whole life sentence but instead received a 45-year minimum term and is unlikely to be released until at least 2058, when he will be 67. At 48 is Joanna Christine Denny. Denny is the second female on this list after Rose West. Denny committed what came to be known as the Peterborough Ditch murders, which took place in Cambridgeshire in England in March of 2013. Her victims were Kevin Lee, Lukas Slabzewski and John Chapman, all of whom were male and were known to Denny. The three men all died from stab wounds, and their bodies were discovered dumped in ditches outside of Peterborough. In Hereford, 2 other men were stabbed but survived. Dennehy was convicted and later sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order for all 3 murders. At 49 on the list is Paul O'Hara. O'Hara is another individual who has committed 2 murders either side of a prison sentence. On the 17th of March 2014, O'Hara's girlfriend, Shirley Shannon, had called the police about domestic abuse that she had suffered at O'Hara's hands when he burst in and attacked the officers attending with a hammer and chased Shirley into the street, where he then fatally stabbed her. O'Hara had previously been sentenced to life imprisonment in 1998 for murdering girlfriend Janine Waterworth in very similar circumstances, and had only been released on licence in 2013. Next up at number 50 on the list is Ryan Matthews, also known as Stephen Cecil King. Continuing the long list of people who have killed more than once, Matthews was sentenced to a whole life order on the 9th of January 2015 after he pleaded guilty to murdering healthcare assistant Sharon Wall at Wootton Hill Hospital in Gloucestershire on the 9th of July 2014. He had originally been jailed for the murder of 2 other people in 1983 when he was known as Stephen Cecil King, and he was also an inmate at Broadmoor Secure Hospital until 1999. At number 51 on the list is David Mitchell. Mitchell admitted murdering his homosexual lover and convicted sex offender Robert Hind in West Yorkshire less than 18 months after Mitchell had been released from a previous life sentence. Hind's body was found in a river after he went missing in Dewsbury in December. Mitchell had previously been jailed for life in 1991 and ordered to serve a minimum of 11 years for the murder of Kathleen Mackenzie. That had happened on the 4th of November 1990 when he taped her arms and legs together before running a bath and holding her head under the water, drowning her at her home that he shared with her in Westgate, Almondsbury. At number 52 on the list is Jason Gomez. Gomez was jailed for life in 2001 for plunging a 6-inch kitchen knife into Robert Boxer Jones whilst he slept at a New Year's party. Mr. Jones was the driver in the pair's window cleaning business, but had angered Gomez by refusing to work over the Christmas holiday period. On the 25th of March 2015, Gomez, along with another inmate called Paul Wadkin, lured fellow prisoner Darren Flynn into a cell and stabbed him over 190 times with a thin black handle and knife wrapped in material. Despite admitting the murder before the trial, the judge gave him a whole life order for this second murder. 53 is Ian Burley. Burley was convicted of his second murder on the 13th of July 2015 when he and his girlfriend Helen Nichols followed John Heggarty and stabbed him 69 times whilst abandoning his pin. Burley had previously been convicted of the murder of Maurice Hoyle at his house in Barnsley and had served 18 years of a life sentence before being released on licence. As so many others have in the list, Burley was given a whole life order for this second murder. His partner Helen Nichols will serve a minimum of 20 years for the murder of John Gogarty. At 54 is Russell Anthony Oliver. On the 31st of May 2015, the previously convicted murderer Russell Anthony Oliver attacked John York in his cell at the high security prison HMP Long Larton. York, who was jailed for life in 2013 for beating a man to death, died from head injuries. Mr Justice Haddon Cave handed Oliver a whole life order at Birmingham Crown Court on Thursday the 24th of March 2016. At 55 on the list is Anthony Ayres. On the 19th of November 2015, Ayres murdered 36-year-old mother of one, Kelly Pearce, at a friend's flat in Canvey, Essex, by stabbing her 40 times and then beating her to death. Ayres had a previous murder conviction dating back to 1994 for murdering his then-girlfriend, Dawn Wisdom, in 1993, and he had been released on licence in May of 2012. On the 26th of July 2016, he was handed a whole life order at Chelmsford Crown Court. At 56 is Christopher Halliwell. Taxi driver Halliwell pleaded guilty to the murder of Sian O'Callaghan, who he picked up in a taxi outside of a nightclub in Swindon in March of 2011, before stabbing her to death. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Whilst he was under arrest in connection with Sian's disappearance, Halliwell later confessed to killing another woman several years earlier, 20-year-old Becky Godden, who went missing in Swindon in 2003. He led the police to both her and Sian's remains, but the High Court later ruled that this was inadmissible as evidence, as the investigating officer had breached the guidelines of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 by failing to caution Halliwell and denying him access to a solicitor during the period in which the confession was obtained. As there was no other evidence linking him to Becky's murder other than his confession, police were unable to try him and the charge had to be dropped. 4 years later, however, Halliwell was tried for Becky's murder after Wiltshire police uncovered new evidence in the case. On the 19th of September 2016, a jury convicted him of Becky's murder, and on the 23rd of September, he was given a whole life order. Number 57 is Arthur Simpson Kent. Simpson Kent murdered his partner, former EastEnders actress Sian Blake, and their two sons Zachary and Eamon by beating and stabbing them to death at their home in Erith in London in December of 2015. Police believe he committed the murders because she was planning to leave him. He buried their bodies in the garden and later fled to Ghana in an attempt to evade justice, but he was caught and later returned to the UK. On the 5th of October 2016, he was given a whole life order after he pleaded guilty to the murders. At 58 on the list is Thomas Alexander Mair. Mair murdered Labour MP Joe Cox in Birstall, West Yorkshire on the 16th of June 2016. Mair had researched and laid out an assassination plan, and because of the severity of the offence, including the political motivation, with the trial judge stating that he had no doubt that the murder was committed for the purposes of advancing a political, racial and ideological cause, namely that of violent white supremacism, an exclusive nationalism most associated with Nazism, the judge imposed a whole life tariff. At 59 is Stephen John Part, known as the Grinder Killer. Part murdered four men, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, Anthony Walgate and Jack Taylor, between August 2014 and September 2015. Part met all of his victims through gay dating websites, including the app Grindr, convincing them to come to his home in Barking for sex before he gave them fatal doses of drugs. He then dumped their bodies in or near a graveyard within 500 metres of his house. At his trial, the judge accepted that Part's intention was only to cause really serious harm and not death, but made the point that Part must have foreseen that there was a high risk of death, especially after the death of his first victim. The judge said that he'd carried out the murders to satisfy his lust for sex with young men who were rendered unconscious, and gave him a whole life order. At 60 on the list is Leroy Campbell. Campbell raped and then murdered nurse Lisa Skidmore by strangling her with a ligature, and then he attempted to murder her mother by strangling her with a vacuum cord. He then tried to cover his tracks by setting fire to Lisa's room and leaving items with other people's DNA on them. He had been released only 4 months earlier after serving 17 years of a life sentence for raping a woman in her home that she shared with her son, whilst he also had previous convictions for crimes including aggravated burglary and indecent assault. At 61 is Billy White. White killed his 25-year-old girlfriend Lucy Ayres by plunging a kitchen knife into her neck as she lay asleep in bed. He later told police that he had been instructed to by a character from the Tom Cruise movie Minority Report, a film about predicting crimes before they had happened, and instructing him to kill his girlfriend. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Whilst in prison, he, along with another inmate called Gary Lindley, murdered fellow prisoner and convicted murderer Brett Rogers. White's sentence was subsequently increased to a whole life order for this second murder. At number 62 is John Wass. Wass is another highly unusual case, as he, along with Jeremy Thorpe Wing, who is number 11 on this list, are the only two people to have been given a whole life order for an offence other than murder. Wass was convicted of 17 counts of historical child abuse, which included rape, sexual assault and sexual exposure against 3 different victims, going back to the 1960s. At 63 on the list is Alan Maidment. Maidment was sentenced to a whole life order for murdering 47-year-old father of one, Thomas Jones, at his victim's flat in Richmond Court, Berry Street in Clifton. Mr. Jones was stabbed 32 times before his body was set on fire on the 22nd of March 2017. Maidment had only been released 9 months earlier, having been sentenced to life in 1999 after killing Paul Carson, who was 72, with a hammer and serving 17 years. At 64 and 65 on the list is William John McFall and Stephen Unwin. Together they killed Quen Ngok Ngien. Unwin subjected her to sexual and physical assault before driving her to a remote location and setting her on fire. He then drove to a cash machine and withdrew money from her bank account. McFall was also convicted of her murder, but was cleared of another offence of rape. Both men had previous convictions for murder, McFall in May 1996 and Unwin in 1998, both of whom had served 14 years. At 66 on the list is Mark Fellows, nicknamed the Iceman. Fellows, who was 38, shot notorious crime figure Paul Massey with an Uzi submachine gun outside of his Salford home in July of 2015. Mob fixer John Kinsella from Liverpool was also shot dead by Fellows 3 years later. The judge described Fellows as a contract killer and a gun for hire, prepared to kill whoever you were asked to kill. And he added that I have never had to deal with a contract killer of your kind before, and there are few judges who would have. Just punishment in your case requires you to be kept in prison for the rest of your life, as he was sentenced to a whole life order. At 67 is Kahiri Sadala. Sadala was sentenced to a whole life order in January of 2021 for murdering 3 people during what was known as the 2020 Reading stabbings. Sadala murdered James Furlong, who was 36, David Wales, who was 49, and Joe Ritchie Bennett, who was 39, on the 20th of June 2020 in Forbury Gardens, which was a public park located in Reading, Berkshire. The presiding judge, Nigel Sweeney, said, during the course of the attack and afterwards, and because he was seeking to advance a political, religious or ideological cause, the defendant was shouting in Arabic, "God is the greatest, and God accept my jihad." At 68 on the list is Wayne Couzens. Couzens kidnapped, raped and murdered 33-year-old Sarah Everard on the 4th of March 2021. What made this case especially shocking was that Couzens was a serving police officer. He used his position to convince Sarah to get into his police car, where he abducted her, raped her and then strangled her with his police duty belt. He then later burned her body. It later transpired that there were several red flags, with Cousin even being a police officer, but these were not acted upon. Now, a sentence of a whole life order is rare in of itself. It is even more rare for a single murder. But such was the breach of trust and the actions taken by Couzens in using his position as a police officer to commit a devastating, tragic and wholly brutal murder. The only sentence the judge could award was a whole life order. At 69 is David Fuller. Fuller is another twisted and sick individual. In 2021, he was convicted of the murders of Wendy Nell, who was 25, and Caroline Pierce, who was 20, whom he strangled and sexually assaulted after breaking into their homes, months apart, in 1987, in Royal Tunbridge Wells in Kent, in what became known as the Bedsit murders. Fuller was eventually identified as the perpetrator in 2020, when a match was made between his DNA and samples from the case. When he was finally apprehended, Fuller also received 12 years for mortuary offences, having recorded himself abusing the bodies of more than 100 female corpses. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order on the 15th of December 2021. At number 70 on the list is Anthony Russell. Russell is a triple killer who murdered Julie Williams and her son David Williams and Nicole McGregor, whose body was found in woodland near Leamington Spa. Sentencing Russell in his absence as he refused to appear, a judge described him as exceptionally dangerous and manipulative. He admitted the murders during a week-long spree in October of 2020, and a jury also found him guilty of another offence of rape. At 71 on the list is Ali Harbour Ali. Ali murdered Conservative MP for Leigh-on-Sea, Sir David Amos, on the 15th of October 2021, as Sir David held a surgery for his constituents. Ali, who was an Islamic State supporter, stabbed Sir David more than 20 times. Sir David received treatment at the scene for his injuries, but was later pronounced dead. Ali pleaded not guilty to the offence, but did not dispute much of the evidence against him, and had plotted to murder other MPs, seeking revenge against those, including Sir David, who had voted for airstrikes against Syria. The sentencing judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, imposed a whole life order for the murder, saying that he had struck at the heart of our democracy. Sir David was the second MP to be murdered in recent times, after the murder of Joe Cox in Birstall, West Yorkshire, by Thomas Mair. At number 72 is Hakim Kidungu. In the early hours of the 15th of December 2021, Kidungu, who was 32, used petrol to set fire to a block of flats in Reading in which he lived after a dispute with his neighbours. The fire rapidly spread throughout the building, blocking the communal stairs and exits and forcing residents to jump from their flat windows. Many were hurt as they tried to escape, with 2 sustaining serious injuries. Sadly, 2 residents, Richard Burgess and Neil Morris, both died in the fire. 2 months before the fire, Kidungu had been served an eviction notice following numerous noise complaints made by his neighbours, and he also lost his job during the period. And the Crown Prosecution Service made the case that Kidungu blamed his neighbours for his eviction and planned his attack as a form of revenge. At number 73 is Damien Bendel. Bendel killed Terry Harris, who was pregnant, along with her children John and Lacey Bennett, as well as Lacey's friend Connie Gent, who was 11 years old. He killed them with a claw hammer at their home in Derbyshire in 2021. Terry's mother described Bendel as a psychopath and a master manipulator. Bendel also confessed to the rape of one of the children prior to the murders. When he was arrested by police outside of the house, he told officers, "I've just killed 4 people." He was subsequently sentenced to a whole life order. Number 74 on the list is Luis de Sousa. De Sousa shot and killed Metropolitan Police Officer Sergeant Matt Ratana with a gun that he had smuggled into the custody centre where he was handcuffed. De Sousa shot him in the chest at point-blank range at the custody block in Croydon, South London, in September of 2020. De Souza was brought in the early hours of the 25th of September 2020 after being arrested for possession of cannabis and ammunition. A gun concealed in a holster around De Souza's chest was missed during an initial search by officers, and he managed to retrieve the weapon whilst travelling in a police van to the centre, despite his hands being handcuffed behind his back. At number 75 is Lucy Letby. Letby is the third and final female to appear on this list. Letby was an NHS nurse working within the neonatal ward in the Countess of Chester Hospital. Between 2015 and 2016, she murdered 7 newborn babies and attempted to murder 6 others by injecting them with insulin and air. She was found guilty following a 9-month-long trial and was handed 14 whole-life orders, making her the worst child serial killer in modern British times. She is currently appealing her conviction, with a hearing due to take place in April of 2024. The penultimate person on this list, at number 76, is Lawrence Bearton. Bearton is the final person on this list to have been convicted of murder, released, and then to have murdered again. In 1995, he, along with another individual called Michael Pluck, murdered 2 sisters, Eileen Duddell and Elsie Gregory. Bearton and Pluck bludgeoned, suffocated and burnt the sisters to death in a burglary that went wrong at their home in Herringthorpe Valley Road in Rotherham in 1995. Bearton was released on licence from prison before he then attacked 73-year-old Pauline Quinn with a wooden coffee table in her own home after gaining entry through the back door. The mother of 3, who lived alone with her dog, was left with catastrophic fatal head injuries after the attack inside her Nottinghamshire bungalow on the 9th of November 2021. For this second murder, he was awarded a whole-life order. The final living person on this list at the time of recording, at number 77, is Marcus Osborne. Osborne was given a whole-life order following his admission of the double murder of his ex-partner and her new lover, before he then raped another woman at knife point with whom he was holding captive. On the 15th of May 2023, Osborne stabbed to death his former partner, Katie Highton, in the front hall of the house that they used to share together. She was stabbed 99 times. Not content with killing her, Osborne then used Katie's phone to lure her new partner, Stephen Harnett, to the house. When Stephen arrived, Osborne stabbed him to death as he had Katie, before mutilating his body and cutting off his penis and part of his scrotum. And the house where the murders were committed had 4 children upstairs and another victim who was being held captive by Osborne. After the murders, Osborne then laughed and jeered before forcing the woman he held captive to strip naked, before he then raped her, telling her it was the last time he was going to be having sex in a long time. Now, I've actually done a video on this case where I explain, by going through the judge's sentencing remarks, how the judge decided to award a whole-life order. That's all for this video. If you do have any comments, then please drop them down below. If you did enjoy this video, then please do consider giving it a like. And if you'd like to see more from me, then please do subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. Take care.